Well, welcome back. Um, hope you enjoyed the treats outside. Thank you to our first round of speakers. That was really great. Thanks, Shannon and Angel. I appreciate you being here. We have a couple of very different talks in our second set of talks today. The first is given by David Gagnon. He's the director of Field Day, an education research laboratory at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Very important. Composed of a diverse team of educational researchers, software engineers, artists, and storytellers, his lab is focused on the intersection of situated and social cultural learning theories with digital media, specifically video games, mobile technology, and mixed reality. Field Day's games have won numerous awards and are used by hundreds of thousands of learners yearly. Field Day also develops and supports the Eris platform, an easy-to-use augmented reality game developed tool, as well as Sifter, a mobile platform for designing citizen science and citizen ethnography projects. I am pleased to welcome David Gagnon.
So thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me out here. A slight jab is that I joke about how whenever I go anywhere from Madison, the weather's always better when I get off the plane. But unfortunately, this is the first time where I had this moment where I was like, no, this isn't right. So yeah, I'm honored to be here and to talk with you. I think, as Jesse hinted at, I'm probably coming at some of these discussions from a slightly different angle, given that my job is to sympathize with the novice. It's what I live and breathe and think about is what does the outsider, what does the layperson, what is the public, what is the third grade kid, how do they see the world, and how can we make experiences that maybe draw them into new wonder and new curiosity. So I'm going to actually, given that we are kind of hopping across disciplines, instead of speaking as though it was an audience of learning scientists, which would probably be my academic community, instead what I want to do is just tell a whole bunch of stories of the kinds of things that have been design experiences that have allowed us to learn a little bit more about some of these ideas around stories, around community, around making, around place, around play. And I'm hoping those stories and really the projects that they manifest, I'm hoping that ends up being a nice kind of interdisciplinary space for us to have a conversation that's kind of fruitful for everyone. So I am at Field Day, and I was lucky to found this little group. It really is a mix between a research lab and a media studio. So we're a small team of 6 people, full-time, and then about the same amount of contractors and such. And we're within a really large university, so UW-Madison and Wisconsin Center for Education Research ends up being kind of a big place to be. I believe it's safe to say that WCR, the center that we're part of, is the largest education center in the country by money at least. But it certainly is a very rich environment to be, given that I have a meeting at 9 a.m. that's about astrophysics, and at 10 a.m. and it's about critical history, and at 11 p.m. it's about music. So it's the world that I kind of live in, is hopping between disciplines on the regular basis. So I really have 3 main things that I'm hoping to talk about. And the first one is the relationship between stories and facts. I have noticed over my career that one of the primary tensions that comes up when working with experts of any sort is that sympathy for the novice, that sympathy for the newcomer. So let's talk about that a little bit, starting with art history. I was known to crash a lot of courses at UW. It's kind of crazy to not do so. There's no security, and you can sit in on any class you want, and there's a bunch of brilliant people. And at one point, I sat in on an intro to art history course, and I have to compliment the lecturer. He was really fantastic in terms of performance and whatnot. But let's talk about the format, the media of the course. You've all been in one of these, right? Okay, so there's a slide projector, because digital obviously is an abomination, so we need like the original slides. And generally speaking, the courses that I've sat in have involved looking at an image, talking about its genre, the date it was made, who made it, and then maybe an anecdotal kind of story about how it was exhibited or whatever. And when you watch people study for this, what you see is the media that they can represent this knowledge in is a flip card. And every coffee shop in town around finals lights up with students with their decks of flip cards with the work printed on the front side, and then on the back side, the date, the author, the genre, and then maybe a sentence about the anecdotal story. I'm going to contrast this with a course that I saw from Craig Warner, who wrote a book, A Change is Going to Come, Music, Race, and the Soul of America. He also teaches a history course, and I was lucky enough to do more than squat, but I actually registered as even though I wasn't in school anymore. 3 hours a day, every day, listening to entire music tracks, so 3 to 5 minutes at a time, in a group of 300 people. But what was so interesting about this course is that he superimposed the narrative of the civil rights movement with the lowbrow pop music that was being played at the time. And the synergy between the two created an environment that, I cried multiple times. I got involved in different activism. As an educational transformative experience, it was the narrative that made the facts matter. So, in response to that, the iPhone came out. This dates me a little bit. And I was in the middle of my graduate studies, and I was really curious what this personal device would do for the way that we interact with the stories around us. So the first prototype was a project called Get In with Warhol. And the idea was I wanted to take this lesson that I'd learned from Craig Warner in the civil rights movement, I wanted to apply it to art history again and reimagine what it would look like for a gallery experience to be narrativized in the same language of call and response that was happening between artist and audience, and then artist and artist. And the question was, if we were to pick up Andy Warhol as one of the key figures, what stories and what call and response could we get into that defined this movement of art? So I developed a really simple thing over the period of a weekend, and built out a prototype that worked out of the Milwaukee Museum of Art that has a small pop art collection. Always wanted to be here for that. And the idea was, here we are in this gallery, everything insanely decontextualized. And what would it look like if we could use the mobile device to kind of put Andy in the room with you and then tell you what he cares about, what missions he cares about, and bring you as part of the narrative. I was really inspired by the movie Forrest Gump. I had no critical theory at this point. I had no historical inquiry theory. But I loved Forrest Gump's notion of history. How did Elvis learn how to dance? No one really knows. So let's play in that space with the fact that we have little Forrest in his metal contraption legs. So took a lot of liberties with this. And the idea was, what would it look like, and this was what the early prototype looked like, if we put you right in the middle of these little missions, meeting all the characters of the pop art movement. Well, that kind of got out of hand a little bit, because what happened somewhere along the line is that Microsoft Excel-based authoring tool kind of met a need for a lot of researchers and artists and storytellers and historians. So over the period of several years, just decided that we would give this thing away for free and make it open source and try to form a community of people that really were all asking the question, how could place become the index into a multiplicity of narratives? So if we think of where we stand right now, this incarnation is just the current winning one, right? But what are the other layers of this place, latitude and longitude? And if you dig into that topic at all, you'll encounter at some point place-based learning, who I'd really say Smith and Sobel would be kind of the architects of, or at least the ones I've read. And they start introducing the idea that place can't be about latitude and longitude anymore. It's about social cultural context. It's about contest. It's about history. It's about art. It's about winners and losers. So exploring these ideas, we thought, what would it look like to democratize who can make augmented reality? And if we can get third graders to do it, then that's probably a great place to start. So things like the Global Game Jam in 2011 were really probing that. What would it look like to have a whole bunch of people around the world all at once make these augmented reality experiences about their places? And as have been mentioned by a few people speaking, the process of design would actually be one that they would learn through. Here's one that came out of that era. And I'm going to do this as rapidly as possible, but just to explain kind of what this really looks like. So Dow Day, there was a documentary about this, and it really, what it was is a protest that took place during the Vietnam War in the UW-Madison campus. And I'm just going to play the little cutscene that opens it up. Oh. Or not. I'm not. We have to hand wave. The short version of this is that some Dow Chemical employees came to the UW-Madison campus right in the height of the Vietnam War, and they were recruiting for new chemical engineers. Dow Chemical made napalm for the war, and because of this, many students protested their showing up on campus, basically saying that institutions of learning should be safe from warmongering companies that are profiting from the atrocities formed by the things they're making. It didn't go well. The local city didn't know how to deal with those kinds of crowds. The chancellor didn't know how to deal with those kinds of crowds. A lot of people were hurt in the middle of this, and it just didn't go well, is the best way to put it, for anybody. What we wanted to do is unpack the fact that stories like this usually don't have good guys and bad guys. Like, there's usually not, in real life, simplistic binary conflicts of Dow Chemical recruiter is a bad guy, protesters are good guys, and one should win. And what was wonderful, this is kind of my introduction to history inquiry, what was wonderful is as soon as you look at the primary sources, what you find out is these Dow Chemical recruiters, they didn't want to make napalm. That Dow as a company didn't want to make napalm. The government was twisting their arm and forcing them to. And that the protesters, while they had the greatest agenda in mind to really look at the atrocities of napalm, they were also just kind of out looking for a fight. And the police just didn't know how to deal with this, and there was some bias against the rich, privileged kids that are hanging out at college doing college-y things and college-y protests, while they're a bunch of blue-collar folks. And then just fire code wasn't up to spec in a bunch of the buildings. And what the game does is on the mobile, you start with a map, and it basically gives you an introduction to this, and you walk to a location where you meet your newspaper editor, and your newspaper editor says, you have a role. You're a writer for tonight's paper, and your goal is to go get the scoop, go get the story, go meet all the people involved in this thing, and put together a piece that we can publish to explain to people what's going on here. So we pretend like it's 1967, and we invite you into role-playing that. The first person you meet, the chancellor, you again see it on the map, the first person you meet is the recruiter, and you physically walk over to another part of campus where the recruiters were set up, and the phone vibrates in your pocket, and then a photo of the recruiter, the actual person who was really there, you have a conversation with, which really looks kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure set of little, he says a line and then you pick what you want to say. And almost everything was pulled directly out of interviews, so it has kind of the right tone. And you quickly learn about Dow Chemical's role in this. And then you walk over to the protesters and you kind of face-to-face virtually meet them as well and look at the flyers that they were handing out and hear their heartfelt initiative here to stop napalm. Eventually you end up in the middle of the tear gas being fired and people running and screaming in every direction. And the goal was at least that you would feel like it's happening around you, that it was happening in real time. And there are some moments that feel like that, standing up on the top of Bascom Hill, holding your phone out, and because we have the historic footage of it, watching the marchers come up the hill towards you, because we've put you in the same position the camera was in. So the idea, though, wasn't about facts, it was about stories. It was about the people in conflicts and complexity of a real thing that really happened, and as much as possible it wasn't curated, meaning we've seen this experience be used by people as part of history studies and Vietnam studies, but we didn't have like a message in it. As much as possible, we tried to let the actors speak for themselves and show that to some degree conflict was inevitable, given these worldviews. So that's Dow Day. It was one of the first ones that happened like that by a guy named Jim Matthews with a little bit of my support. Another one right here in New York City, right on the NYC campus, was done by Rabbi Owen Gottlieb. This went up for a Games for Change award 3 years ago now, and I'll play just a short clip from what this one looks like. Fashion, we're doing a historical situated documentary, a documentary that goes out into space and time. This one had a really nice look at the end, though, because you realize that the main topic and conflict of this was a fire that was formed at the Triangle Factory, where a whole bunch of immigrant workers were killed. And they basically were working in a sweatshop. And the reflection of this game at the very end is to realize that the device you're playing this game on was also part of a similar system of people working in horrible conditions to build the thing that you're getting to have the privilege of playing a game and reflecting on these topics with. So another kind of higher production, so with this one we start shifting from really just a tool for researchers and experimenters and artists to, I think Owen, coming from a background of film, kind of like really brought up the notch of actual production. Along that same line, now we'll take another leap, and I actually, I think it's worth bringing this one up here, but I'm going to actually make a little edit, and I'm going to skip this and go to another spot before I come back here. So I want to start there and just talk about the nature of story, but now I want to make the shift to another way that we can think about mobile devices and locations and distance, and that's this notion of field work, which I'm just so captivated by right now. So again, I'm taking inspiration from technology, and I'm saying this thing isn't just a screen, it's a camera. And how can we use it as a way, as being a device that has a camera and internet connection, how can we use it as a way to get you to see things that are right in front of your nose, but this darn perception thing gets in the way of you actually seeing? It's one of the kind of funny things about studying the mind, is you realize that there's just so many things that we can't think. There's so many things we can't perceive because we just don't have the right primer in place. We don't have the right schema in place. So how can we think about this device allowing you to see the invisible? Along that line, we created this new platform called Sifter, and Sifter is a fieldwork platform. Like Eris is bigger. It's been used by hundreds of thousands of people. Sifter's quite a bit smaller. It's been used maybe in the tens of thousands of projects. So order of magnitude smaller than Eris, but still kind of a blooming thing right now. And the whole idea of it is that most citizen science projects or most citizen ethnography project, for example, StoryCorps, $500,000 goes into building one of those apps. So what would it look like, again, if we could democratize who was able to build citizen science apps? So Sifter is designed so that a normal person who knows how to use a mouse and probably a few other skills, in about 5 minutes can easily set up a project that they can deploy to their audiences to go observe some phenomenon. We've really targeted school teachers as our kind of primary builders. And the idea has been, how do we think about the world outside the classroom as the primary place of teaching? And what we want you to do is build a sifter around an abstract topic, and then send your students out into the real world to see that thing, that phenomenon, and then use the mobile tool as a way to encourage that behavior, and then come back into the classroom to visualize what you're all finding in the real world. I'll just pull out a couple interesting examples. Snow Challenge, Tom Dubois, he's a folklorist, did this project, and it's part of a folklore of Midwestern cultures course that he teaches at the college level. And in Snow Challenge, you're learning about the Sami people group and culture, and the language, the complex language they had around snow. So in class, we talk about that kind of abstractly, and you can say the fact, the Sami people have a lot of words that describe snow, but the Sifter project is to then, among a snowy campus, go and document and take photos of the different kinds of snow, tagging them with the word you think Sami would use. Then what happens is a visualization like this is created, and back in the classroom, you can look at individual notes that were created and have a discussion about them. Again, kind of bridging the abstract with the concrete. Another example that's just a kind of a whole other direction is a bunch of poets out at the University of New Mexico who decided that they wanted to take the poetry that they were writing and locate it in terms of the places that inspired that poetry and create these kind of like informal tools, this informal kind of relationship of geolocative poetry. So I asked this question earlier, like, well, you put a thing into the world and then you wonder like who will benefit from it. And one of the things that's been interesting about Sifter is that I really enjoy watching the emergence of it all. And say, I had no idea to support poets, but I'll take it. Let's see what happens. This went into another direction. I was working with an ornithologist, and I sat in on a class that he was teaching, and it's 7 a.m. We're in a really dark basement of the zoology building. It's one of those rooms that has like the little windows like way up high, so you're kind of like not anywhere near outside. And kind of like the art history room, you know, there's a projection of a bird, and then there's like an MP3 of a bird, and then like the next slide. And what was so crazy is if you like looked through that little window, you realize the arboretum is right there, and there's birds everywhere, right? So the question was, what would it look like if we took these devices that everybody had in their pocket again, and we played around with a version of Sifter, and what we started experimenting with is how could we provide some playful guides, or really how could we play around with not just perception, but with motivation? How could we think of some of the lessons we've learned from game design to influence this behavior? So we built a version of the game that, well, now I'm calling it a game. Shot a little shift here. It had quests. And quests were like little postage stamp sized, I don't think I've got no, I don't have a slide of that. A little postage size set of the species of birds that are probably in the area, from least to more rare. And then also some key locations you should go, some urban, some rural, or some like in kind of parks, and you know, some right in the middle of concrete. So we rolled that version out to the students, and then we waited a few weeks, and then we had another version where each of those little quests had a point value associated with them. And then it led to a leaderboard where all of the students would be ranked, right, in this course. And then we had a group-based leaderboard, so there was Team Red and Team Blue, and they were competing for the most observations of birds. The only other thing that probably needs to be mentioned is that the requirement for any of these is that you had to provide enough evidence in the photograph or the audio sample you took that a third person could come and identify the species of the bird. This is not Scout's honor, we wanted data. So quick takeaways, the quest doubled participation, meaning we required them to have 10 observations per week. On average, we saw 20 observations per week. When we added the leaderboard, it doubled again, so we saw 40. On interviewing the students, though, something really interesting happened. The quest they described subjectively is something that made them meditate on birds, think about birds, and stay out in the field longer than they normally would, because it gave them that next challenge. The leaderboards, on the other hand, led them to thinking about how to get the most amount of points in the least amount of time, and led to all kinds of non-celebratory, non-meditative activities on birds, and instead had people meditating on points. And we saw behavior like taking a photo of the same robin for 1 point each to get higher on the leaderboard versus going for that, red-tailed, hawk that will give you 50 points, but is much harder to find. The next one I'll mention right now is we're still kind of actively exploring this through design experiments. So one of the things that we just launched right before I came out here was a fellowship that we're doing with educators in Wisconsin, where we are really curious how field work as a practice will engage lots of different topics and lots of different disciplines. So we have these 15 teachers that came with us to the university and now are implementing a fieldwork activity in their classroom. And I'm looking at it as really a way to kind of learn from them how fieldwork might influence their teaching practice. So all the way down to 3rd grade and up to 12th grade across humanities topics as well as kind of hard science topics. So over this next few months, we're just going to be watching a couple thousand kids spread through the through the state that are going to be out doing field work in their field, everything from interviewing their neighbors around political discourse to, looking at invasive species in the local forest. So I think we're going to learn a lot from where they even take that. Okay, third part of 3, this notion of contrived space. And as a place that thinks about museums, I think we play in that avenue or that place pretty often. So contrived spaces and virtual travel. Now is when I want to play this clip. So this is super promotional, I'm sorry. It's just, you'll tell by the music. This was a project where a history center that's very well attended reached out to our group and said, we have a team of about 40 people that can fabricate anything that you want. And we have a budget of $4 million, and we have 15,000 square feet. And we know that what we want is a pretty large-scale, start-to-end, what is Minnesotan history like? What are the key themes? So we got to work with curators and fabricators and storytellers. So this was really a kind of a lesson learned in history and how history curation takes place. But the result at the end of the day was a built environment with a mobile game that talks to it in real time, so that the different people, the different kids that go through this would have an individualized experience that would put them right in the middle of the story as a contemporary Minnesotan resident, that they would get to kind of experience what some of the other cultures and manifestations of Minnesota were all about. So again, this is a promo. Don't insert your credit card at the end.
Play the past. Play the past.
This is awesome.
Puts history right into students' hands,
Awesome.
making it more engaging and more fun.
I won. Yes.
Play the Past is a groundbreaking new way for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders to use handheld technology to deepen their learning.
They used fur and traded with the Europeans.
Students are given an iPod Touch to explore the Then Now Wow exhibit at the Minnesota History Center.
You guys trading?
Yeah.
Students use the iPod to uncover stories, pursue quests, solve problems, and make choices to personalize their learning.
You need 2 stars for each one.
Students also collect digital items throughout the exhibit.
Dude, you know we can actually trade items?
These items go into a digital backpack that's sent back to the classroom. Teachers and students can then download the items for further research or new projects to build on what they've learned and extend the museum experience.
Okay, what do we do?
Play the Past also addresses state academic standards in multiple disciplines and brings the Northern Lights curriculum to life.
A couple of things like to pull out of this, because this was like masterclass in some pretty hard topics. Iron mining. Okay, so you can say, here was the learning objective. Iron mining was dangerous and tedious work. Now, the way that kind of the final design came around with that was you put on a hard hat and you scan, there's a full-size like cardboard-ish cutout of the foreman, and you quickly find out you're from Sweden, you're trying to make a living here, you just got off the train, you're on the iron mine, there's a lot of jobs to be done, get to work. So you can go to either the station where they're drilling, you can go to the station where you're loading dynamite and actually doing demo work, or you can go to it's called the backman, and this was the unfortunate person that would go ahead of everybody and like poke up at the ceiling and try to find the weak spots, right? So we had, 5,000 square feet to make this place. It's this dark, the ceilings and stuff kind of wrap around. There's weird sounds. It's kind of scary, to tell you the truth. And then it talks in real time to the mobile device. So everybody's got these lanyards and the mobile's hanging around their neck. And what happens is, let's say as a driller, every time you successfully drill a hole by walking up to a physical thing and like this in your hands, you make like 2 cents or something like that. And your goal is to make a quarter, because this is like what it would take to basically break even on the day. So you're making enough money to pay the rent. Now, unfortunately, what happens is if you get it wrong, you get injured. And we kill you all the time. This is one of the advantages of digital media, is we get to just turn up the volume so that you actually have the experience. It leads to all kinds of really interesting and curious collaborative work. Certain kids will come in and they will like self-organize into the most efficient mining group with like middle management and such. Other groups, the thing I was looking for as a researcher was role play. So one of my favorite stories, and this has happened a lot, kids will often take on British accents because just accents are accents. And they have no idea what a Swedish accent sounds like. And then hop around on one leg for the rest of the museum experience because they got their leg blown off in the dynamite area. And when I see that kind of behavior, I get really excited, actually. Another part is the sod house, where you're learning what it was like to build a sod house and how to survive the winter and deal with the grasshoppers. And again, it's kind of a very rich physical environment where the things you do on the phone change the environment and the other way around. But here's the one that was the most interesting, the teepee. So obviously, Swedish folks weren't the first folks in Minnesota. But the relationship that the History Center had with the Dakota people that really would probably be the easiest line to draw to the Minneapolis region was very tried. It was a really, really unhealthy relationship based on 20 years of basically the History Center lying to them about whether they had human remains or not in their archives. So really, really broken relationship. And what was interesting about this is then as a museum designer, you can't not have a reference to the Dakota in an exhibit like this. So imagine just a big circle on the ground, that's where it's gonna go, but you can't speak for them either, right? So as a young designer, I think I made every possible mistake there, but cultural appropriation and to begin in these design meetings when some of the elders really started to warm up to the idea. And one of the solutions that ended up coming up that was pretty awesome was this breakthrough where the eldership said, no one will speak for us, but if you want to put some contemporary Dakota heritage people, if you want to highlight them, a spoken art artist, a graffiti artist, a guy that's known as the sous chef who does super high-end catering using traditional meats and berries and such, they can speak. And that was one of the hardest parts of the exhibit was pulling through that. So again, these are completely contrived spaces now. We're not up north living in a sod house, and we're not in the iron mine. We've made and fabricated these spaces to tell stories, and that leads to this really interesting set of curation. But at the end of the day, it was all about just adopting stories and adopting an identity and roles and goals in this exhibit. Okay, total spin now. What if we think of history students, specifically global history students, who are in DeForest, Wisconsin, and have never left the country? What does it look like for them, instead of writing essays about things like the slave trade or about Somali piracy, what would it be like instead of writing essays for them to create interactive narratives and games? This was kind of a little experiment. And I would suggest to you that different modes of representation allow us to think different things, and they certainly have us ask different questions. We're not asking about facts and kind of remixing sentences together, but now we're thinking about characters and conflicts and systems and resources. So we did this little experiment. We had 250 students across the school all day long, one session after another, 6 sessions a day for 2 classrooms, and all these kids built these games instead of wrote these essays. And what that taught us is that this method can scale, and that's really exciting, to think about other forms of representation of research other than text. So this is something that we're currently moving forward with, and what we've really been pitching in what someone called a STEM-obsessed school system right now, is we're happy to take your STEM money, and we're happy to rebrand our history, cross-cultural history scholarship as STEM because you're building it in digital tools. But we're really hoping that we're going to be able to launch this in a much larger way and research it a lot more deeply. Okay, this is going a whole different direction about kind of virtual and contrived spaces. But there's a whole field of things that I encounter working with hard scientists that you can't go there. Those spaces or locations or distances are unfathomable. You just can't see it. You can't be there. You can't embody that place. And one of these recently was working with a research group called IceCube. IceCube is one of the largest, I don't know if it is the largest, but one of the largest research projects that's happening in our modern world. It's about a $500 million project. It's down in Antarctica, and there is a kind of like a little box on stilts where 50 hardcore scientists live. These are not your lab coat scientists. These are mountaineers and backpackers and explorer-style scientists that have made the trek down there. And what they're doing there is they have built a very large sensor into the ice that can look out into the universe in every direction at once. So it's a three-dimensional telescope, I guess you could call it. And really what they're doing is looking at the very, very origins of the universe through studying these particles called neutrinos. If you have any one of these ice cube scientists try to explain what they do, you can imagine it's pretty challenging because they are doing basic science. Whether this will turn into the next iPhone gizmo, it won't, right? This is like origins of the universe kind of research. So there was a breakthrough that happened as we start describing the distances and the locations that they're excited about. When we tried to pin them down and have anything factual, it was like scholarship and education just like butted heads. Because any scientist worth their salt is going to want to be as accurate as possible. But accuracy doesn't lead to good communication because it's not empathetic for the learner, right? So there was this change that happened when our art director started asking, well, what would it feel like to be in front of a black hole? Or why is it that you do this? Like, why is it that you analyze data all day long? And they started using words like that they are pioneers, that they're explorers, that they're going deeper into the universe themselves, very embodied language. Like they saw themselves going into the universe. And they would describe things like black holes and neutron stars, the objects they are observing, with words like terror. If you could ever come face to face with a black hole, it would be the most terrifying, hellish experience you could ever imagine. So as designers, we're like, yeah, there we go, okay. So the idea is we have 5 minutes with really 5th grade up to explain the curiosity and wonder that these ice cube scientists live with. And through a very, very locative kind of experience that's simulated, you start in Antarctica and the snow is blowing hard and it feels cold and scary and windy, and you see a neutrino come in and you see it off in space and you chase it out into space, hundreds of millions and millions of light years out, going through the solar system, looking back on our small galaxy, and finally coming face to face with a black hole. And it's completely an emotional experience, and that's its purpose. So this has been another fun project in that we're finding museums that are starting to pick it up. We're like everything we do is free and open source. It's kind of part of our mantra. So we're leading to some new curriculum and new materials that can be used by teachers all over the world for free. And then the last one that I'll mention is another history game. We're working with the Wisconsin Historic Society and Wisconsin Public Television to produce this game that kind of informally we're just calling the CAP game. But the idea here is that not many students in the state are able to ever make it to the capital. If you live in rural Wisconsin, that can be probably up to about an 8-hour drive. So a small group of students come to the capital, learn about what happens at the capital, but most students kind of study it from this really weird way. When you hear people that study the Capitol talk about it, they talk about what kind of rock it's made of. They talk about what year it was built. They talk about a lot of things that Smith and Sobel, again, from a place-based perspective, would find pretty irrelevant. Instead of talking about it like that, what would it look like to see the Capitol as a place of debate and discourse? It's a rally point for your marches and your protests. It's a symbol of democracy. It's a symbol of where we can get together and argue, right? And that's its purpose. So at the same time, we really wanted to explore the idea of teaching history as process instead of history as a set of facts to be known. So working together with a bunch of curators and historians, and then of course our team of designers, we built this game where you play the role of Joe, who takes on increasingly identity of a little detective, learning about things like the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, these big contested ideas through running around interviewing people, picking up artifacts, of course, that are all primary sources, and then following lines of facts and kind of doing some inquiry work. So that's interesting in the sense that it allows people to kind of go to the Capitol virtually. But the part that I'm most excited about now is that we're making the shift now to actually taking the show on the road pretty literally and working with 6 different communities across the state where we'll be workshopping with their teachers to build local history levels about the artifacts that exist in their downtowns or their rural community, and having their teachers develop content with us, including a couple First Nations again. So the Oneida Nation is the main one that is written into this. So we're really curious to actually provide a platform for people to see their own local histories. And if we are successful in this, everyone in the state will see themselves in this and take on these practices of inquiry. And having kind of a virtual experience of the Capitol or a virtual experience of these other communities, as well as a kind of an interesting hybrid one of their own local community. So on that note, we'll kind of wrap up. But the 2 invitations is that I'm really into creating things that amplify other people's interest and other people's scholarship. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, like I said, it's free because our tax dollars already paid for it. Thank you, National Science Foundation, and then groups like MacArthur. But I'm really curious as well to really put before you that we're a research studio that's really thinking about scholarship, but really how we reach out to the public and increase the conversation that we're having between scholarship and the public. So we're very open to collaborations. Everything we do is a collaboration. So we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Any questions, collaborators?
Yeah, very interesting. How much of your research was based in some sense on Bucky Fuller's World Game Society back in the 70s?
I'm not even familiar with that.
Okay. Talk to
So
you later.
0, apparently. But I would guess if it's as influential as you hint at, that maybe secondarily influenced by it.
I'll talk to you later.
Great.
You alluded to it, I think. I was interested in scale, especially with the virtual reality, the augmented reality. How does, if at all, how does scale work?
Tell me what you mean by the word scale.
Size, so sitting in this room, for example, this chair is the size of a chair.
1-to-1 relationship.
It is?
Yeah.
Wow.
Wait, the chair is a 1-to-1 relationship with the chair.
Oh, yes. In augmented reality, would it be the same?
If you want it to be. So, for example, working with the stuff in the museum, for example, if you're talking to a virtual character and you are holding your phone, they're the height that they are. In other environments, like we're working with a media artist in France as part of the Big History Project, and he has this walking tour where every step is 1,000,000 years, right? And it's kind of a meditation on the origins of the universe. So scale is something that's mediated in augmented reality, and that's kind of one of its fun affordances. As a designer, you get to choose how you want to play with that. I know Owen did some early experimentation with, instead of being out here in front of NYU's campus and dealing with that park, what would it look like if that thing was compressed down to the size of your playground or your gymnasium, so there was still a sense of placeness, but it was mediated. It wasn't the real place, it was a proxy place. So I think that's been one place where I've seen many artists and designers play with that, and even some dissertations that have been based on that. How do we research the notions of scale and embodiment? Yeah.
Oh, we got one more.
Yeah.
We have
It's come up a couple of times, this question of how real does something have to be, and I'm wondering if you're learning through doing, kind of what does a cartoony kind of experience work best to engage a kid, let's say, or do you kind of push towards as close to like photorealism as you can get?
Man, it's one of those things I've thought about so much that. Let me suggest that the mind is the most potent high-def 4K visualization tool ever. So sometimes the simple sentence that you're a spy, there's another spy in this room, and you got to figure out who it is a much richer experience than us trying to augment something in a heads-up display that you're wearing on the HoloLens that's on your head. So I think design plays with that, and every project ends up having a different, way that we don't get into the uncanny valley, but we give the mind enough prompts to set it free into being really unleashing the imagination. So with VR, it's kind of hard. You got to put something on the screen. So working with astronomy imagery ends up being pretty easy. Where we've failed is faces of any sort. Just don't do faces. They're just really hard. Well, I mean, some people can do faces that have orders of magnitude more budget than we do. So there's exceptions to that. But I would say that in general, all of our work leans towards the abstract and tries to cheat any way we can, knowing that the imagination is part of what we're designing for. Yeah.
So just piggybacking off of that, you showed us different projects that have both adults and children working in this augmented reality space, and I was wondering if you had noticed any patterns of how adults and children are relating to the tools that you are giving them. Are they relating in the same ways? Are they relating in different ways? Is it too early to tell?
Just a couple of anecdotes on that one, because that, again, you can imagine someone's dissertation being dedicated to that. A year and a half ago, I was invited out to Florence, Italy for this really cool group called Prisma, and they intentionally designed around that. They said, we're going to have 5 different teams in 5 countries, and we're going to pair up young people with the elderly, and they were going to co-develop games about local ecological issues using eras. So it was really something to see a design where that intergenerational dynamic was intentionally part of the design of what was getting produced. And I would suggest it ended up being very rich in that. My favorite team, for example, had these photos of, just a bunch of super cute little French kids sitting at the feet. I mean, these are like little kids. I think they were 4th and 5th graders, sitting literally at the feet of this oyster farmer who looked like a bazillion years old. You could see in their eyes, they're just gobbling up every word of his, and eventually what they do is they produced a geolocative experience telling how oyster farming had changed over the last 50 years. So those are the stories I'd like to highlight. Another odd anecdote, though, is at the History Center, one of the things that's happened is that because there's adults usually with the kids, because it's like the bus shows up from whatever school and it's got a couple adult volunteers, pretty regularly what will happen is that if we interview the adults after, they'll think the kids are just running around like crazy people and not learning anything. And that's been kind of an interesting thing, because when we interview the kids that are running around like crazy people, bouncing around on one leg, speaking British accents, you can't fathom how they're having time to read any of this. And then they will have we've got like a 100-page evaluation on this, a very, very detailed explanation of the individual people, dates, systems, and stories that are built into this design because they embodied them. So I find, if anything, there's a disconnect between the experience that kids have maybe when they're young and they're moving quickly, and they don't look thoughtful and contemplative, and the reality of it. So those would be the only things I would say to that.
Great.
Okay. Yeah.